Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Anthony Radich, the Executive Director of WESTAF, the Western States Arts Federation. With me today is Brian Points, Director of Consulting at WESTAF's data partner, Economic Modeling Specialist International, or EMSI. This is the first of a three-part webinar series concerned with data related to the arts and the broader creative economy. This first webinar, Why Data, is centered on key things every arts and creative economy administrator needs to know in order to make use of available data. The second webinar, titled Which Data, will sort through and compare and contrast the arts and creative economy data projects that are currently underway. The third webinar, titled Presenting Data, will present ways to best put your creative economy data to work. It will feature information on how to best present data to make your case. This webinar will be approximately 30 minutes in length. Following the presentation, we will have time for questions. Please note that the way for you to ask questions is to enter your question into the chat box on your screen. You will see the chat box on the left-hand side of the screen, and questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. The purpose of this webinar is really to help leaders in our field, many of whom are occasionally overwhelmed by the various data offerings that are out there, to begin to sort through the data available to us. We understand that many administrators in the arts in particular have no extensive background in data analysis or statistics, etc. They really come from a different part of the educational structure. There are a number of data wonks in our field, but frankly, for the most part, our field does not have that capacity broadly at all levels. Yet, we hear repeatedly from administrators that there's an endless flow of data causing a level of confusion and a call for help in sorting through some of these data opportunities. And that's what these are all about, these webinars are all about. So if you're puzzled by the avalanche of data that's out there, you're not alone. You're one of many, and we're happy to help you begin to sort through it. Before we begin, I'd like to ask our special guest, Brian Points, who works extensively in the nonprofit education field at EMSI, to share some perspectives on how the education field is using data and working with this high volume of data that we have today. Brian?
Thanks, Anthony, for inviting me. Yeah, the educational industry, educational institutions have a long history of using data, but that's not doesn't have universal application. They use it for some things, they don't use it for everything. So for example, most colleges and universities have an institutional researcher, and their job is to use internal data, track learning outcomes, know where there may be shortages for certain resources that would support their programs, etc. That's been around for 50 years. The expectation that universities and colleges would use data for things like program planning to know what's needed in the workforce is relatively new, really over the past 20 years or so. And then more recent than that even, there's really been this explosion of third-party data sources, scorecards and rankings and the like. The college scorecard from the U.S. Department of Education comes to mind there. And that has really pushed educational institutions to a higher standard of sophistication in data use than a lot of other industries. Because either people are going to be using data to assess your college, and either you're going to know about it and you're going to be on top of it, or you're not. So it's not unheard of in this day and age for a student to show up at an institution and really have a plan to say, I saw online that you offer such and such program and that I can make such and such earnings after I graduate, and that these businesses in the area are offering jobs right now that are in this field. Can you help me achieve this goal? That's really unprecedented. That hasn't happened until recently, but that's starting to happen a lot, is what the feedback we get from our educational institutions. So the page that's actually in front of you is from one of EMSI's clients, North Central State College in Ohio. We've developed this tool called Career Coach, and this is intended to face a public audience and be a free tool that helps potential students and their parents figure out what careers they can go into and how that aligns with the programs that are offered at North Central. So they are on top of the data. They're using it to their advantage. In the arts industry, honestly, the level of scrutiny and pressure isn't as high right now. There still is this need to kind of prove your worth, and why are we sending dollars to that entity? But it's not as strong as it is with education because of the student debt load in various other regions. So it's actually a good time and a good place for arts organizations to be using data because you don't have to rise above that general din the same way that the educational institutions do. Just the action of using data at all could potentially give you a lot of traction and a lot of audience. That's what I see going on in education.
Well, Brian, thanks for that perspective. I just want to underscore what you said about being proactive about data. There have been times in the arts field when we have definitely needed data to defend where we are, and it's certainly nice now that we have access to more data than ever before in many different forms to be able to think about how to use data proactively to shape a future rather than just defend our present. So well said. Brian, we invited you here today as an on-the-ground professional in the field of data to share advice about some foundational ways to think about data and its use. I know you prepared a short brief on the subject. I will now turn the webinar over to you to present that briefing. Brian?
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Before we get into the specifics about these various categories that we're going to cover, I'm just going to touch on each of them briefly. Firstly, define and measure. So this is about determining who you are and what you're trying to accomplish and what you can claim about your organization and your region using data. Comparing, one of the advantages of using data is that it actually can give you some comparable statistics that can put you on a level playing field with other industries that tend to get more attention locally or other creative clusters and geographies elsewhere in the country. So you get some comparable statistics to help you understand what your region's strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and to garner more attention. Demonstration. It's about crafting a message that's impactful and resonates with your audience. And planning. So that's defining the objectives that you're aiming for. You need past data in order to understand where you're going to go in the future. So with that, we'll talk more about define and measure. So state and local arts agencies really depend on elected officials and government administrators because they're the ones that a lot of times give them funding. Not exclusively, but to a large degree, there is that funding stream. So we know, all you know, as well as us working in WESTAF and EMSI, that there is real and substantial value, non-financial value to the arts, but you can't just rely exclusively on that. You have to be able to talk about things in terms of jobs and dollars. Those are the common denominators that all players within the economic marketplace can understand and they can use for comparisons. So while we may love it if elected officials looked at our efforts and said, we want to support this for art's sake. It's art for art's sake. This is a good thing, and that's why we should support it. But it's difficult to make that argument in a void. For example, if you go to a public meeting, whether it's city council or a private meeting, and you say, we need X amount of dollars because this artistic organization really heightens our appreciation of the world around us, gives us a greater appreciation of art, and it connects us with our heritage. So those who hold the purse strings, some part of them are going to be intrigued by that, but somewhere in the back of their mind, they're also thinking, yeah, but we only have so much money. We need to finish this infrastructure project. We need to finish this intersection. I don't know if we can do this. So you're going to run into those kinds of roadblocks if you're not actually quantifying impact in some way. Alternatively, you can make that same request, but then add in that the project or the organization that you're asking to support financially is going to generate X dollars of economic impact. Well, if you do that, now all of a sudden they're able to see the financial and the non-financial value of your project, and they can have kind of apples to apples, compare it to other opportunities that they have. While political and administrative decisions are not always made with rationality in mind, if you have data, that tends to support your argument and put you on more solid footing. Another reason that we use data to define and measure is that in doing so, it helps you really document the size and the scope of your creative economy. In this slide, we've got a bit of a Venn diagram. There's creative industries, there's creative workers, and there's this intersection point. This is a pretty common methodology for those who are looking at quantifying what their creative economy is. They're creative industries. These are businesses that some creative impulse has driven the development of that entire company. That does not mean that everybody within that company has a creative job. You could be a janitor, you could be a tax accountant. You could think of multiple examples there. In some way, their job is still reliant upon that because the artistic innovation is what created the need for their job. They're creative workers. These are people that could be, an example here is a designer at a bank. You could have a graphic designer working for a cement mixing company. Any number of things you can think of. Their job within that organization is to add their creative talent to improve the outcomes for that business. So you want to look at both sides of that, and it's going to give you a bigger number, but it's also going to give you a more accurate number. So you want to define the size and the scope. You can use this kind of methodology. You can use a different methodology. That's fine. But you want to talk about things in terms of jobs and earnings and revenues because that's what's going to resonate. And it's going to get you a seat at the table. We're going to talk about comparing and diagnosing. Whoever it is you're working with in the government sector is an economic developer in some sense. That may be their actual title. It may not be. They may be working for the mayor's office or something else, but they care about creating new business and jobs and income. So you want to position yourself in terms and in a line of thought that they can understand. So I think one helpful thing to keep in mind here is that as an artistic organization, you are an economic development engine because you are encouraging tourism, which is effectively an export. So one of the reasons that economic developers get obsessed with things like large-scale manufacturing businesses is because they're export-oriented. When you send a product out, that brings money in that previously didn't exist. So this is kind of like the fresh water that's needed to keep the pond from getting brackish. You need to have a new stream of income coming in. Well, arts organizations are doing the same thing on a different scale. You're going to have people coming in for experiences, for visiting museums, for going to concerts and artistic events. That's a tourism industry. It's generating exports, which is generating money and a net impact on the economy. So you can talk about it that way. That's going to get you into different conversations. You can also talk about your multiplier effect. That's a common output that will come from an economic impact study, which is something that the WESTAF and EMSI can help you out with. A multiplier effect is just going to say for every one job or every $1 that's generated in this immediate industry or group of industries, what other jobs are generated outside of that due to purchases from other businesses and income being spent in the region by people who work for those businesses. So you think about things in terms of positioning ourselves as an exporter. That allows you to compare yourself to some of these other businesses, industries and businesses that may typically get more attention from economic developers. Also, it can allow you to compare yourself to other artistic clusters and regions across the country. Some projects I've been involved with, you can really get a lot of mileage out of that. Maybe you're the third largest city in the state that you're in, but your arts cluster is the biggest. Well, that's a pretty meaningful statistic, and you wouldn't know that unless you're looking at the data. Another great thing about data is that it helps you assess your strengths and weaknesses. So you can use those to help diagnose what you're good at and what you're not. For example, maybe your data analysis reveals that you've got this great big cluster, group of musical artists and performers, and they're in your region, you have no recording studios for any of these people to actually lay down tracks and record their albums. Not all of them are going to be doing that, obviously. Some of it's just recreational. But some of them are, and if they are, they're taking that money elsewhere to do it. So this is what we would call a supply chain leakage or an import gap. It's an opportunity to improve that cluster by introducing new industries that support that cluster. It's also an opportunity for an entrepreneur to fill a real need in the region. And if you look at your artistic cluster, you can determine things. You can see holes like that. So that's one quantitative example. It doesn't necessarily have to be a highly quantitative process. You can also see things through qualitative assessments as well. So for example, perhaps you, through talking with the entrepreneurs and the artistic people in your area, you discover, well, we've got a lot of craft artists, musical artists, et cetera, but we don't have enough venues for them to actually demonstrate their skills. So they're having to go elsewhere to do that, whereas you could set up a monthly market for craft artists, or you could set up a new summer concert series, something like that, that's going to keep some of that money in region and give them more opportunities. Next thing we talk about is using data to demonstrate. And the first topic there is forging partnerships. When you bring the right kind of data to the table and you bring it to people at the point of decision, it can really build bridges. It can start conversations in ways that they weren't previously occurring. To give you one example of a project EMSI is involved in, we worked with a college in central Illinois, and they wanted to develop a student-facing data tool. It's actually similar to the tool that we talked about at the beginning of this webinar, that would educate students on what they could do and why they should go to college. That college started talking to economic developers and workforce developers and universities, and they all collaboratively decided this was a good idea. They decided to fund it, and they decided to market it. So they used data to make the case that middle skilled jobs are important. We need to educate people about them, and everybody came to the table. That's the sort of thing you can do with data as well. One thing, just a note of caution here, it's great. I strongly recommend that you would think about the quantitative things that you can confidently make the case for. So, what jobs should be included? What categories of jobs should be included? What is your literal multiplier effect from those jobs? There's a softer side to this that's relevant but shouldn't be emphasized too much, and that's kind of the creative class, creative clustering argument. That's been around for about 10 years, and there's been a lot of holes poked in it. There's still good content there, but it's not something I necessarily want to carry that banner into every discussion that you have. So focus on the things that you're most confident about, and then make parenthetical statements about, yes, and also it can stimulate innovation and help the tech industry grow, and some of these other side effects that it's been known to have. Dispelling misbeliefs about your contribution is important as well. So you can actually look at where the money is going. Some of these donors and these funders and these state organizations tend to think of arts as a drain. It doesn't have a net benefit or doesn't generate new jobs or new earnings for the region. Well, you can have data that shows that that's not true. And again, I encourage you to think of yourself as an export-based industry. Stuff goes out, money comes in, economic developers are happy. Next, we're going to talk about planning. If you're going to be planning, envisioning for the future, you need to understand what occurred in the past. That helps you establish trend lines and baselines. To give you one example of where just places we've seen this done wrong. Let's say that an organization wants to increase the private foundation funds that they receive by 25% over the next 5 years. Sounds like a great idea. If you look at the data, you may discover, well, we've been trying to increase those funds. We're marketing hard. We're going back to our donors, and it's just not generating any increased revenue. Data is telling you should probably be cautious about that and look for a different metric to improve. Benchmarking is very important for any type of data analysis. In fact, I'd say it's one of the main reasons that you should do an analysis of your creative economy. That's basically a way of saying, here's where we are, and we want to get better from here. It's like marking a line on the wall so you can see where how much taller your kids have gotten a couple months down the road. You can't really do that well unless you are looking at past and projected trends for your region. If you want to see your creative economy grow locally, the rate of growth that you would want to see is going to be much different in Austin, Texas than it is going to be in Muncie, Indiana, because the economy that you exist in is different. A fairly flat, slow growth trajectory would be great in a place like Muncie, Indiana. It would be a failure in a place like Austin, Texas. So I'll pass it back to Anthony. Go ahead.
Great, Brian. Thank you for that summary. You covered a lot of pretty important areas. I know there are many, many more ways to use data, but a lot of what you covered is pretty central to what we do in the arts or are trying to do on a day-to-day basis. So thank you for putting that together. I now want to turn to some questions that I'm going to ask you related to being an effective consumer of data. In order to be an effective consumer, you need to know a number of things. And we will cover a number of them, including a definition of objectives, understanding data quality, and presenting data in the next section. So let me start, Brian, by asking you this. You're involved in a number of important projects. You work in the area of education, but you also work in local, state, regional, economic development, and many other areas. So you're a person who needs to go out and select data. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, good question. Like anything, the best thing is to start with the end in mind. And part of knowing that is knowing who your audience is and who it is not. Because there's a lot of data that you could collect that, although interesting, has no pertinent effect on your conversation at all. You don't want to spend lots and lots of time gathering that type of information. A few pressing examples that I've seen over the years, let's say that the organization you work with is primarily based on nonprofit arts. Well, in that case, you would want to only collect data on the nonprofit arts to the extent that you're able, because the for-profit industries aren't really speaking towards the issue at hand, and people can easily poke holes in that data and say you're overinflating your case. Another thing that I often see is just discussions about what region should we use to analyze. That's necessarily going to be a political discussion, and it should be. Sometimes you need to look at your city. Sometimes you need to look at your city and its suburbs. Sometimes you need to look at your entire metro area. Again, it's about who you're trying to appeal to and who should you include as a result of that. So you want the size of your tent to really match what people you want to appeal to. And there's no one-size-fits-all answer for that. It could be your city, it could be your metro, in some cases it could be your entire state.
And if I could just comment here, I think one of the great things about having so much more data and flexibility in ways we can manage data available to us is that Brian mentioned the political jurisdictions, and some of those change in rather strange ways. But these days we can get not all data, but a great amount of data down to zip code level. And that allows us to create districts that resonate with people and collect data from those districts that will resonate. So that's the good part of having a lot more available to us. Can you talk a little bit, Brian, about the issue of there being a nexus between the data collected and the research question?
Yeah, this really closely aligns with the previous question because it's still about selecting your parameters for the analysis. When we talk about nexus here, it's really just talking about what's the connection between what you're doing and what people care about and what's relevant. So to give another example in this case, should you include the textiles industry in your creative industry cluster for your study? That actually depends on the region that you're in. In some cases, you may have major large-scale manufacturing that has thousands of people at a plant. That's not really a creative industry at that point. Alternatively, perhaps you have just cottage industry of people doing screen printing, small businesses, creating leather goods or custom dresses, anything that's kind of craft made and is really driven by a creative impulse and is locally driven, then that should be part of your cluster. So there's, again, not a one-size-fit-all kind of answer there. It's about what's going on in your region and what you should include and what you shouldn't.
Thanks for those comments. And I would just add, I think frequently in our ambition and enthusiasm about being part of the overall creative economy, some public sector funders in particular fail to note the degree there is a nexus or not. A lot of public funders do have a little bit to say about filmmaking in their region, but frankly, a lot of those bigger industries, those bigger numbers, the nexus between a public funder and a vast pool of workers and a vast amount of revenues is pretty limited because there is no plan. There is maybe, again, a nexus in terms of topic, but not much else. So it's not like we can't talk about the overall creative economy in an area, but I think we have to do a better job of defining what the nexus actually is, unless there's an intention, again, for the state arts agency or the local arts agency to jump in and start aggressively funding film and making a difference. Then there is a nexus. Otherwise, it's something that is data that can easily be set aside by people who are looking at it critically.
Right.
Brian, can you talk a little bit about when you have a project that needs data, how you go about deciding the most efficient way to collect that data?
Yeah, and like a lot of things, I'm going to say it depends. But I'm an economist, so I'm expected to say that, right?
Right.
You have to consider the streams of data that are available to you and the quality and the accessibility of that information. There are a lot of good free sources that you can get from federal websites and others, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And there are also paid-for sources that are well worth their cost as well. A couple of just general guidelines. You want to grab data that's relevant. Sometimes in the arts studies that I've seen, since this is new and exciting, there can be a temptation to just wrap your arms around as much data as possible and then just pull it in. And that's not really a sustainable approach. It's going to cost you a lot of time and money. And you need to think about your budget, your audience. And lastly, something that people don't think about often enough is just the burden of updating that data in the future. So it may be cool to think, great, it would be really interesting to know what's the average square footage of an office space for the artists in our region. Yeah, that's a cool metric. Do you want to put all of the hours that are required to discover that into your process every 3 to 5 years when you want to update that number? So good guidelines to keep in mind. Alternatively, you could take more of a dashboard approach. So that's where you just select a few pertinent metrics that are somewhat easy to update, and you can easily track how you're doing against those initial benchmarks that you set. And that can be preferable to a large-scale kind of bottomless analysis. And groups like WESTAF have great resources for doing that kind of thing. The CVSuite has data that's almost constantly updated, every quarter with here are things that we think are important for measuring your creative economy. You can see how you're changing over time.
Well, you've already introduced my next question here, but let me ask you that as the flow of data in the arts and creative economy increases, it becomes available in many different forms. Could you tell this group the difference between data as it is found in A, national level data streams, B, indexes, and C, local surveys?
Sure. Starting with the national data, most of these are federal sources. The United States is a great place for getting free federal data. A lot of other countries don't have that luxury. A few I'll recommend: the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They are the best organization at counting jobs and earnings. They have multiple different types of studies, and you can get that information via their website. It's also fairly frequently updated, and with a slight lag, but fairly frequently updated nonetheless, and goes down to the county level in most cases. The Bureau of Economic Analysis is also worth mentioning if you want to make more of a numbers, dollar numbers type of argument. That would be the place to go because they have data on earnings and revenue. They're better at counting dollars than they are at counting jobs. American Fact Finder is the best place to go for getting data from Census. Census has a ton of different studies that come out at different times and measure slightly different things. All of it, you don't have to know all of those sources. You can just go to American Fact Finder and search for what you're looking for. And it's not the most user-friendly system because their search system still needs a little improvement, but it's a good place for finding any basic stats that you're looking for. Next on to talking about indices. The WESTAF Creative Vitality Index is a really good one. I mentioned that. There's a few other national sources that are available as well. Surveys, you may sometimes want to go this route if there's certain data points that you can't get through what we call secondary sources. So to just make a quick definitional annotation, a secondary source is something where a question has already been asked and you just need to research and find those data. Primary source is where nobody's asked a question, so you need to go ask it. And when you're doing your local studies, you're going to run into a lot of cases where nobody has asked that question before, and if it's important enough to you, you're going to have to do a survey. When doing those, keep in mind that you can do them in a non-scientific type of way, and first off, you're not going to get great results, and you could be easily shot down when you present that information. People in general don't think about things in terms of sample sizes and what's the confidence interval, but they instinctually can say, well, how many people did you actually survey? Did you get enough information to you want to avoid those kinds of questions. So work with a professional, whether that's universities often have resources on that, or just somebody in your region who's taking classes on how to do survey research and elicit questions in an unbiased way.
One thing I want to bring to the table here today is I've been in, unfortunately, several meetings where some kind of economic impact or economic report is given, and I'm maybe sitting next to the director of the Chamber of Commerce for the state, and she or he are amazed and appalled and realize that the arts people have their facts wrong. How do you work to double check what I would call startling revelations to ensure that they pass a believability test in your work?
Right. I've seen it too, and for my years of working in consulting, it just has to become part of your process for checking and double checking and using a third person to do the checking who's not the same person who initially collected the data. So if you're doing it internally, you've got to build in that that redundancy of multiple people who are looking at the data before it's revealed. So if you get a situation where you say, hey, we're going to have 5,000% growth in our architectural services industry, and people look at that and say, that's wrong, that doesn't make sense, you've already lost at that point, and you can't regain the trust that you were hoping to get when you started the process. Also, especially when it comes to economic impact studies, there are really 500 ways to do it right, or 500 ways to do it wrong, and one way to do it right. And you'll see these studies, sometimes it'll say, some event is going to completely saturate the demand for hotels within a 500-mile radius. And it just doesn't pass the smell test, and it's going to get shot down. So that's about knowing what you're doing and hiring a professional who knows what they're doing. And regardless of how you're doing it, having multiple eyes look at it and kind of question the truthfulness and give it the smell test. Now, sometimes you will see situations. Yeah, I was just going to say that you will see situations where the data reveal something that's truly astounding and interesting, and those are the sorts of things that you do want to emphasize. Those are the points that are going to have the most impact, but you need to make sure first that you've actually done your diligence and those points are correct.
Well, thanks for that advice. One thing we've done here from time to time is actually paid researchers from other fields who are economists to look over some of the work we've done, and really for fairly little bit of money. Sometimes we've heard some comments back we don't like, and sometimes we don't like them because we find out we're using correct language but not language that's used commonly in that state to describe a certain phenomenon. So I always think it's really helpful to share and have reviewers from outside our field look at these things. It certainly gives them, the research tool, an outcome and longer legs. We have so many national data sources available to us now, and that will likely only expand. What are some thoughts about using the national data sources and localizing the data, bringing it down to the local level? What are some cautionary thoughts on that?
The key point here is to just get as local as you can, and you won't always have the luxury of getting as local as you would like. Or sometimes you're going to face the trade-off of if I go down to zip code level, the data I get is from 2010, whereas if I go to the MSA level, the data I have is from 2015. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish, which is the right answer there. But when you're looking at data, be very cautious to not use just general national level statistics or even state level statistics to describe what's going on locally. What we have in the slide here is one example. This is real EMSI data. Nationally independent artists, that's an occupational title, earn about $21,000 per year. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, they earn about 14, so a third less. Apologies to people in Indiana. I know we've picked on you twice today. So if you don't use that local data, then you're overinflating your argument. You're not really telling an honest story. So as long as the data are available locally, get that and use it.
You mentioned in your last answer data with two different time frames. And how do you work with data in terms of dated data, the correct telling of a story according to time through data, et cetera? What are some thoughts on that?
When you're pulling together multiple different data sources, you're going to deal with the fact that things have to be cobbled together with different time frames. The American Community Survey, for example, the Census Bureau, they intentionally use panels from 2010 through 2014 because when you look at a 5-year period, that's when you get enough data to actually be able to say something. So it's just part of what we have to deal with. We have to be careful of is to not use data that's going to tell a misleading or inaccurate type of story. So I and some of you have probably seen studies that go back as far as 2002 or 2007, 2008. If it's way back, then the data are just old and a lot has changed since then. If the data are from the period of the Great Recession, and that was a period where the entire economy was just picked up and turned upside down, the numbers that you get are going to not be accurate because it's going to be an extremely deflated period for every sector of the economy, and the forecasts are going to indicate pretty marginal growth. So if that's the situation, it's really important that you seek to update those numbers. But you can't really be, similar to what I said about the last answer, you just can't be a perfectionist when it comes to timing. You have to deal with the trade-offs of recency versus geography in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I would add, take a look at when the data were collected. Frequently you'll get a report that was issued in 2015, but the data might be from 2012, and some of it might be from 2010, and it's important to know that. You've certainly worked, Brian, on a number of projects like we have where you put a lot of work into some research, and you don't feel that the product is being used to its fullest extent. And what are some ways people who commission research or do their own research can make the best use of that research?
The best studies I've been involved in are ones where the organization puts as much effort into the marketing and promotion of the message as they do into the actual analytical study. The Houston Arts Alliance I partnered with on several occasions, most recently last year, and they do a great job of that. They produced a study in 2012 that was a blend of quantitative information about their creative economy and personal vignettes from entrepreneurs and business people who were actually in the creative economy in that region. It had a lot of great impact for them, and they also produced a nice, flashy, interesting report that was easy for people to read. So produce content that's worth reading and is appealing, and also think about the means of delivery. You may need to do multiple things from wide-scale public presentations to marketing campaigns, press campaigns, individual meetings with influential decision makers, printing off individual flyers that you can hand out at events or at your office. All of those, you want to use multiple platforms for getting that message out.
Great, thank you. And that will be a major topic of our third webinar, which will be June 21st. So Well, Brian, thank you for all those answers. Don't go away yet. I want to say a few words, and then we'll have time for a few questions. I want to conclude this section of the webinar by saying that the data streams available to art and creative economy interests today far exceed those that were available only a few years ago. Our challenge is to find a way to properly access and deploy this data for the benefit of the work we are engaged in. And when we do this, being smart about what data we use and how we deploy it is central to the long-term credibility of our field. And if we involve professionals from our field who are data experts and professionals from other fields, education, economic development, and elsewhere, I think our success in the use of data and the guidance they give us will be most helpful to our reaching the goals we set for whatever data goal we have. We now have time for a few questions. The first question we have is, and probably I'll send it to Brian, what is the multiplier? You talked briefly about that, but can we just go back to that and talk about that, and then we have several others. We have quite a large group today. I don't think we can get through all the questions, but we will do some of them. So Brian, what is a multiplier in short?
Yeah. So I'll first start with the explicit part of that question with what is a multiplier, and then I think the implicit part of that is what is a good multiplier. A multiplier is basically whatever your initial industry that you're talking about, in this case creative, artistic organizations and businesses, when you add one job in that cluster, how does it increase jobs elsewhere? And this is all based on the science of input-output modeling that economists have been working on for 100 years. When one job is added, that's going to create demand for other products and services that those companies are going to need to buy, and it's going to create more money, which is going to create more regional purchases. So when you think about the multipliers, it's a number that's it's always going to be greater than 1, and it can go as high as 9 or 10. And whatever the number is, it's saying for every one of these, you get X additional number of them elsewhere. What is a good multiplier? That is really difficult to answer and avoid because it depends on the size of the region and the depth of how much industry activity is going on locally. So with more context, you can kind of answer that question better.
Great. Thank you. Another question is, I have a concern about only looking at nonprofits. The creative supply chain is both for and nonprofit. Should we be looking at for and nonprofit creative industries? I'll start, and Brian, you may have a few comments. I agree, we should be looking at both. I think when we talk about the issue of nexus here, we talk about how the policy crosswalk is often not made. Yes, there always is a creative dimension to many things, and intensively creative connection to several things. But again, if we are claiming that we are, as nonprofits or public sector funders, that we indeed create most of that creative economy, we are not telling the truth. I think we can tell the truth by being accurate. We do have a claim to part of that. We do something in education, we do something here and something there. But again, we are not the primary leveragers of that. Now, there's a whole other conversation about building the creative economy, and I think that's totally appropriate, and that can be largely separate from the nonprofits and the public sector funders. My cautionary notes are really to the nonprofit and public sector funders to, you can describe the breadth and depth of the creative economy in an area. That's great, but try to avoid by implying that indeed your entity is responsible for a great deal of that. It's responsible for some part, but in many cases not very much of a part. Brian, anything to add to that?
That's a great answer. Just the general concept is, if I'm watering my own lawn, I can't claim responsibility for grass that grows in my neighbor's lawn. Just because it's related doesn't mean that it's you who did it. And as you said, there is that dotted line where it's about the creative cluster, because there's sometimes there's intense connections between the nonprofit and the for-profit sector, but you always want to be conservative where you can in making your your estimates. And in a case like that, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at both and to look at it proportionally. You know, what percentage of our total creative economy is nonprofit and which is for-profit.
Okay. Another question. I always find it challenging when I run data reports on smaller rural counties or zip codes in Utah, because many of the specific industries or occupations show growth as a percentage, but the actual numbers may be an increase from 2 to 3 curatives, for example. How useful is this, and what are some of the other pieces of information that I can focus on when dealing with smaller communities? This is a good EMSI Brian question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you're dealing with small regions, that's going to be the reality of what you see. Add together everything that's relevant, including the industry and the occupation side, and look at that as a total growth rate. But inevitably, you are going to see in small regions, you're going to see small numbers. So when I'm doing reports and presentations, I'm always cautious about presenting percentages when I'm talking about a small area, because 40% growth may mean 4 jobs, and that's not particularly relevant. So yeah, your point is well taken to be careful about that kind of thing. Another thing you may run into when you're looking at small regions is suppressions, or they just don't tell you anything about what's going on because it would be revealing confidential information. And organizations like WESTAF and EMSI work hard to unsuppress that data by combining a lot of different data sources together. So if you run into that, there's your answer. And
you use the term suppression. Could you just explain that to the group today? What is a suppression process, and why are things suppressed?
It's something that's built into all of our federal data collection sources. They are not allowed to say everything that they know, because it would say too much about people like you and I, and we don't want that. We like our confidentiality. So they have general rules which we don't need to go into, but if the rule of thumb is if the data provides too much information about an individual company or an individual person, they will intentionally suppress that, and they'll usually mark it with like an ND for non-disclosed. So that's a situation where they just can't tell you what's going on, but companies like EMSI can, because we bring together the BLS and the BEA and the census and all of the various subcomponents of those organizations. Great,
thanks. Another question. My metro area has a history of using inflated figures for measures of the economic impact of the arts. A better quality study will likely result in different and lower numbers. How do you propose I manage this? We've run into that several times. I can think back about 6 years ago, we did an economic impact study for a state, and the result was about half of what it was compared to a previous study. And we looked into this, and the previous study was just very poorly done. But they had already marched out there and told the world that this state had this level of economic impact. So one thing this happens unfortunately with some regularity, and we recommend that there are many other things to focus on in a report on nonprofit arts and or creative economy, or all together, and to maybe focus a little less on that final giant number that got them into trouble, and let people kind of forget that number over a couple of years and focus on a couple other areas. I think long term, as economic development bodies become more sophisticated, you cannot go to them with advocacy level data. It has to be accurate, it has to be reliable, it has to be robust. They know the difference, and I think we in the arts have to step up and make sure that we are working at that level. Brian, anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's a really delicate situation. If there's a couple of different ways that could happen. One, like Anthony was just talking about, just the prior contractor did it wrong. In which case, there's no way around. You have to be honest with your own studies and deal with the consequences of what people have to say about that. There's other cases where it's more nuanced than that, where it's just the cluster that we're looking at has changed because some national study says this is the right way to do it. And I've experienced that before. In those cases, it's not as if they were wrong before. It's just that it was a different target they were aiming for. So I'd recommend doing an analysis that looks at both. Here's the old data. Here are the numbers with the old clusters we used. but we're seeking to use this new cluster going forward, and here are the numbers for that.
Thank you, Brian. And with that, I think we are out of time. I want to tell the participants that we will have make available to you a presentation, both the images and the audio, and that will be posted soon on the Creative Vitality Suite website. I want to close by especially thanking Brian Points of EMSI for taking the time to participate in this webinar. I also want to thank the CVSuite team here at WESTAF for organizing this event, and Susan Gillespie, part of the CVSuite team, who will be reaching out to you to answer your questions that we were unable to get to. I'd like to invite all of you to please join us for the second webinar on Tuesday, May 17th at the same time. The subject will be which data, and we'll go through the 4, 5, 6 different major data sources in the arts and do some analysis of those. And conclude by thanking you again for joining us, and very much hope this was useful to you. Thank you.
Guys still there?